I have spent the last 48 hours reviewing classified energy logistics data, IEA emergency oil market reports, CSIS strategic assessments, and live tanker tracking feeds out of the Persian Gulf. And I need to be direct with you about what I am seeing, because virtually nothing being reported in mainstream financial media captures the actual severity of what just happened at the Strait of Hormuz. Here is the framing you are getting from the networks. A ceasefire was announced, oil prices dropped 13 to 15%, markets stabilized, and the crisis is de-escalating. That is the headline. That is what they want institutional investors, retail consumers, and foreign governments to internalize. It is also strategically incomplete to the point of being functionally misleading. Here's what I am actually looking at. Before this conflict escalated into open kinetic exchange, 16.3 million barrels per day of crude and condensate were transiting the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That number represents roughly 20% of all oil consumed on this planet. It is not a regional statistic. It is the central, load-bearing column of the entire global energy architecture. And, as of the 7-day window ending April 6th, according to Petrologistics tracking data, that flow had collapsed. Not dipped, not corrected, but collapsed to 1.2 million barrels per day. That is a 93% reduction in throughput at the single most consequential maritime energy chokepoint on Earth. The mainstream media covered this as a supply disruption. What I am looking at is a controlled demonstration of veto authority over the global oil supply, and there is a profound strategic difference between those two things. A disruption is an accident, a pipeline rupture, a hurricane shutting down Gulf of Mexico platforms. A disruption has no author, no intent, and no leverage. What happened at Hormuz was not a disruption. It was a deliberate, sustained, and ultimately successful assertion of Iranian sovereign control over the transit rights of every barrel of Gulf oil. Saudi, Emirati, Kuwaiti, Qatari, the needs to move east or west through a 21-mile-wide navigational corridor that Tehran's military assets can range from fixed coastal batteries, subsurface assets, and distributed fast attack platforms simultaneously. And here is the part nobody in the financial press is explaining clearly. The ceasefire did not reverse that control. It formalized it. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's statement following President Trump's April 7th announcement was not diplomatic boilerplate. Read it operationally. He stated that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible, quote, via coordination with Iran's armed forces. That is not a reopening. That is a toll booth. That is Iran having successfully converted a de facto geographic advantage into a de jure administrative function. The power to approve or deny transit to vessels carrying other nations' sovereign energy exports. What I am briefing you on today is not a ceasefire story. It is an architectural story. The architecture of global oil flow, the assumption baked into every futures contract, every maritime insurance policy, every refinery throughput model in Houston, Rotterdam, and Singapore, has been structurally altered. The pre-war baseline of frictionless Hormuz transit no longer exists as a default condition. It now exists as a permission, one that Iran grants, Iran prices, and Iran can revoke. The futures market has not priced this. The physical market, where Brent equivalent crude was trading at approximately $140 per barrel, while futures quoted $95, tells you that traders closest to actual molecules understand the asymmetry. The divergence between paper oil and physical oil is the clearest signal available that the market has not yet reconciled with the new operational reality. That reconciliation is coming, and when it does, the downstream consequences for global inflation, maritime insurance premiums, OPEC internal cohesion, and the U.S. strategic posture in the Gulf will be severe, lasting, and structurally irreversible in the near to medium term. That is what this briefing is about. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a body of water. It is a geometric inevitability. Situated between the Iranian coastline to the north and the Omani exclave of Musandam to the south, the strait measures approximately 21 nautical miles at its narrowest navigable point. But the actual usable deep-water shipping lanes, the channels wide enough and deep enough to accommodate fully laden very large crude carriers, or VLCCs, displacing 300,000 deadweight tons of oil, compress that figure dramatically. There are effectively two navigable lanes, one inbound, one outbound, each approximately 2 nautical miles wide, separated by a 2-mile median buffer zone. Every VLCC, every LNG tanker, every refined product carrier transiting between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea is funneled through those corridors. There is no alternative. There is no routing workaround for the overwhelming majority of Gulf export volume. The geography does not negotiate. This is the foundational constraint that Western strategic planners have spent 4 decades attempting to engineer around, and have never fully solved. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered at Naval Support Activity Bahrain, has maintained continuous carrier strike group rotations in and around the Gulf, precisely because of this chokepoint vulnerability. The doctrine was deterrence through presence, the visual and electronic signature of a Nimitz or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier, its embarked air wing, its Ticonderoga-class cruiser escort, and its Burke-class destroyer screen was intended to communicate an unambiguous message to Tehran, that any attempt to interdict Hormuz transit would be met with overwhelming kinetic response. For decades, that doctrine held, not because Iran lacked the will to challenge it, but because the cost-exchange calculus was prohibitive. That calculus has now fundamentally shifted, and the geography explains precisely why. The Iranian coastline along the northern Hormuz approaches is not a flat, exposed, literal environment. It is a fractured, mountainous terrain, the tail end of the Zagros mountain range descending directly into the water, riddled with natural concealment positions, cave systems, and elevated firing positions that provide Iranian military planners with overlapping fields of fire across both transit lanes simultaneously. The Keshem Island complex, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, sits directly astride the inbound shipping lane. Abu Musa Island, occupied by Iran since 1971 in a move still disputed by the UAE, provides a mid-strait platform less than 60 nautical miles from Dubai's coastline. These are not incidental geographic features. They are pre-positioned, permanent Iranian-controlled fire control platforms embedded inside the choke point itself. The physics of the engagement geometry compound the defender's advantage exponentially. A VLCC transiting at its standard laden speed of approximately 12 to 14 knots through a 2 nautical mile wide channel is, from a targeting perspective, essentially a stationary object. Its electromagnetic profile, radar cross-section, thermal signature, AIS transponder broadcast, and acoustic signature is enormous, continuous, and impossible to suppress. It cannot maneuver meaningfully within the lane constraints. It cannot accelerate beyond its hull speed. It cannot submerge, disperse, or deceive. It is, in the clinical language of weapons employment, a high-value, low-maneuverability, predictably routed target transiting a pre-surveyed kill zone at a known, fixed velocity. Contrast that with the Iranian defensive and offensive architecture arrayed against it. Iran has spent the better part of 3 decades deliberately constructing what Western analysts now formally classify as an anti-access area denial, or A2AD, environment across the entire Persian Gulf operating space. The doctrine is not conventional. It does not attempt to match U.S. carrier aviation sortie for sortie, or contest blue water naval supremacy in open ocean. It does not need to. The A2AD architecture is designed to achieve one specific operational objective: to make the cost of forcing Hormuz transit under contested conditions so prohibitive in destroyed assets, in crew casualties, in insurance liability, in political capital, that the calculus of enforcement breaks down before kinetic exchange even begins. This is asymmetric warfare applied at the strategic level, not as a tactical improvisation, but as a deliberate, long-term, resourced national strategy. And the geographical constraints of the strait are not an obstacle to that strategy. They are its central enabling condition. Traditional Western power projection doctrine, carrier-centric, blue water dominant, premised on freedom of navigation as a default operating condition, was engineered for open ocean engagement envelopes where standoff distance, maneuver space, and electronic warfare overmatch provide decisive advantages. Inside the Hormuz operating box, those advantages compress toward irrelevance with every nautical mile a carrier strike group moves toward the transit lanes. The water is too shallow for effective submarine operation. The airspace is too congested and the engagement range is too short for carrier aviation to establish the standoff parameters it requires to operate without exposure to area saturation threats. The terrain chose Iran's strategy for it. Tehran simply had the strategic discipline to build the force structure the geography demanded. That force structure is what the world is now negotiating with, not around. To understand how Iran converted geographic advantage into operational control of the world's most critical maritime chokepoint, it is necessary to move beyond the abstraction of geopolitical analysis and into the specific hardware, doctrine, and engagement sequencing that made the Hormuz closure not only possible, but executable at a cost asymmetry that left conventional U.S. deterrence doctrine with no clean response option. The Iranian military did not close the Strait of Hormuz with a navy, it closed it with a system, the layered A2AD architecture. The foundation of Iran's Hormuz denial capability rests on four interlocking layers, each designed to operate independently if the others are degraded, and synergistically when all four are functional simultaneously. Western military planners refer to this as a redundant, distributed denial architecture, and its defining characteristic is that there is no single node whose destruction restores freedom of navigation. You cannot sink one ship, destroy one battery, or strike one command center and reopen the lane. The system is deliberately designed to survive decapitation strikes and continue functioning. The first layer is the Coastal Missile Battery Network. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, operates an extensive inventory of land-based anti-ship missile systems distributed across the Iranian coastline, the island platforms, and hardened underground facilities throughout the Hormuz approaches. The primary systems in this layer include the Noor anti-ship missile, an Iranian domestically produced derivative of the Chinese C-802 with an active radar seeker, sea-skimming terminal approach profile, and a range envelope of approximately 170 kilometers. Alongside the Noor sits the longer-range Carter variant, extending engagement range to approximately 300 kilometers, and the Khalij Fars, a ballistic anti-ship missile derived from the Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missile family, designed specifically to engage large, slow-moving surface vessels like VLCCs and naval combatants operating within the Gulf Basin. The ballistic anti-ship missile capability is particularly significant from a defensive systems perspective. Standard naval close-in weapon systems and point defense missiles, the Phalanx Sea-Wiz, the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile, the SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors carried by Burke-class destroyers, are optimized against subsonic and supersonic sea-skimming threats, approaching along relatively predictable low-altitude flight paths. A ballistic re-entry profile, descending at high angle and terminal velocity from an apogee potentially exceeding 100 kilometers, presents a fundamentally different intercept geometry. The engagement window is compressed. The angular rate of the incoming warhead at terminal phase exceeds the slew rate capability of many point defense systems. And critically, the kinetic energy of a ballistic warhead impacting a VLCC's deck structure at terminal velocity does not require a large warhead to achieve catastrophic structural damage to a vessel carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil. The second layer is the IRGCN fast attack and swarming craft capability. Iran operates several hundred small, high-speed watercraft, the Siraj, Zulfiqar, and various indigenously produced catamaran hull fast attack craft, capable of speeds exceeding 50 knots in the sheltered, shallow waters of the Gulf. These platforms carry rocket pods, heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and in many configurations, anti-ship missiles and torpedo systems. Their individual lethality against a modern naval combatant is limited. Their operational function is not individual lethality. Their function is saturation, to force defensive fire control systems to simultaneously track, prioritize, and engage dozens of small, fast, low-radar cross-section contacts distributed across a wide angular sector, consuming interceptor magazines and overwhelming the cognitive bandwidth of ship combat management systems faster than those systems can be reloaded or reinforced. The tactical concept is mathematically coherent. A Burke-class destroyer carries a finite number of interceptors in its Mark 41 vertical launch system cells. Once those cells are exhausted, the ship's area defense capability is reduced to its gun systems and close-in weapons. In an environment where land-based missile batteries, fast attack swarms, and aerial drone platforms are generating simultaneous, multi-axis, multi-domain engagements, magazine depth becomes the binding operational constraint, and Iran has spent 3 decades engineering a threat architecture specifically calibrated to exhaust it. The third layer is the underwater domain. Iran operates a mixed submarine force, including 3 Kilo-class conventional submarines acquired from Russia in the 1990s, a fleet of domestically produced Ghadir and Fateh midget and coastal submarines, and an extensive inventory of bottom-laid influence mines. The mining capability is particularly operationally relevant in the Hormuz context. The shallow, thermocline-disrupted waters of the Persian Gulf create extremely challenging acoustic environments for mine hunting operations. Iranian naval doctrine has incorporated the threat of rapid, covert mine-laying operations into its Hormuz denial planning since at least the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iranian mines damaged multiple vessels, including the USS Samuel B. Roberts. A coordinated mine-laying operation across both transit lanes, executed by midget submarines and surface vessels under the cover of a diplomatic engagement period, could close Hormuz to traffic for weeks. Not because the mines cannot eventually be cleared, but because the insurance and operational risk calculus for ship operators makes transit economically non-viable the moment credible mining activity is confirmed. The fourth layer, and the one that has evolved most dramatically in the decade preceding this conflict, is the unmanned aerial and loitering munitions capability. Iran's drone industrial base has produced a diverse inventory of one-way attack systems, ISR platforms, and loitering munitions that have been combat validated in proxy engagements across Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and directly against Saudi and Emirati infrastructure targets. The Shahed 136 series, a delta-wing, propeller-driven loitering munition with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers and a 50-kilogram shaped charge warhead, has demonstrated the ability to penetrate layered air defense systems through saturation, low-altitude flight profiles, and minimal electromagnetic emission signatures prior to terminal approach. Against maritime targets in the confined Hormuz operating environment, where engagement ranges are short and radar horizons are compressed by surface clutter, these systems present a persistent, low-cost attrition threat that cannot be economically countered by high-value interceptor missiles on a sustained basis. The operational execution. What Iran executed in the weeks preceding the April 7th ceasefire was not a single dramatic military strike. It was a deliberate, sequenced application of this layered architecture to achieve one specific operational end state: the cessation of voluntary commercial transit through the strait without requiring Iran to fire a single weapon at a U.S. naval vessel. The mechanism was risk, not kinetics. When Iranian coastal batteries achieved radar lock on transiting vessels, when IRGCN fast attack craft began conducting close intercept operations against commercial tankers, when the Lloyd's of London war risk insurance market began issuing Hormuz exclusion clauses, and war risk premiums escalated to levels that made individual voyages economically non-viable, ship operators did not wait for Iranian weapons to impact their hulls. They stopped sailing. The maritime insurance market, specifically the Joint War Committee's designation of the Persian Gulf as a listed area requiring additional war risk premium, functionally closed Hormuz before Iranian forces needed to fire a single Noor missile at a commercial vessel. This is the operational achievement that demands precise analytical acknowledgement. Iran converted latent military capability into economic coercion through the mechanism of risk perception, and it did so at a cost to itself that is orders of magnitude below the cost imposed on the global oil market, on Gulf Arab producers, and on the U.S. strategic position in the region. Gulf crude exports via Hormuz collapsed from 16.3 million barrels per day to 1.2 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia and the UAE rerouted what they could, approximately 3.7 million barrels per day redirected to Yanbu on the Red Sea and Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, respectively. But their combined overland and alternative export pipeline capacity covers less than 25% of normal Hormuz throughput. The remaining 75% had nowhere to go. Production was slashed by more than 10 million barrels per day, not because Iranian missiles destroyed wellheads, but because there were no ships willing to load the cargo. Iran closed the world's most critical oil choke point with insurance actuaries, not with warheads. That is the tactical lesson. And it is one that every naval planner, every energy economist, and every macro investor needs to internalize completely before assessing what comes next. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz did not produce a regional energy crisis. It produced a systemic stress test of every assumption embedded in the architecture of the global economy. And several of those assumptions have now failed in ways that will not be repaired by a 2-week ceasefire, a diplomatic communique, or a futures market price correction. The consequences are structural, cascading, and operating simultaneously across 4 distinct domains: energy markets, maritime infrastructure, macroeconomic stability, and the geopolitical order that has governed Gulf security since the Carter Doctrine was articulated in 1980. Each domain requires precise analytical treatment. The energy market fracture. The most immediately visible consequence was the violent divergence between futures markets and physical oil markets, a divergence that exposed a fundamental flaw in how the global financial system prices energy risk. Futures markets, Brent crude, West Texas Intermediate, are instruments for pricing expected future supply and demand conditions. They are traded by institutions that are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not taking physical delivery of oil. When the ceasefire was announced on April 7th, Brent futures fell approximately 13% to $95 per barrel, and WTI fell 15% to a comparable level. Financial media reported this as stabilization, as relief, as evidence that the crisis was contained. The physical oil market told a categorically different story. In the physical market, where refineries, shipping companies, and actual end users contract for real barrels of real crude to be delivered to real terminals, Brent equivalent crude was trading at approximately $140 per barrel simultaneously. Jet aviation fuel had surged to $4.88 per gallon, equivalent to more than $200 per barrel. The spread between paper oil and physical oil had reached levels that have no modern precedent in peacetime energy markets. This divergence is not a technical anomaly. It is a signal. It communicates that the participants closest to actual physical supply, the traders, refiners, and ship operators who must secure real barrels for real industrial consumption, have not accepted the ceasefire as a restoration of pre-war supply conditions. They are pricing a world in which Hormuz transit is conditional, intermittent, and subject to Iranian administrative discretion. The futures market, populated by financial actors who will never take physical delivery, is pricing the diplomatic headline. The physical market is pricing the operational reality. As the physical market's assessment propagates through refinery throughput decisions, airline fuel hedging programs, diesel supply contracts, and petrochemical feedstock procurement, the consumer-facing consequences will materialize with a lag of weeks to months, long after the futures price has been cited by politicians and central bankers as evidence that the energy shock has passed. The maritime insurance restructuring. The second domain of consequence is the global maritime insurance market, and its implications extend far beyond oil shipping into the entire architecture of seaborne global trade. The Lloyd's of London Joint War Committee's designation of the Persian Gulf as a high-risk listed area triggered war risk premium surcharges that at the peak of the Hormuz closure rendered individual voyage economics non-viable for standard commercial operators. War risk premiums that historically represented a negligible fraction of voyage operating costs escalated to figures that, combined with the opportunity cost of rerouting and the liability exposure of hull and cargo underwriters, produced a complete withdrawal of voluntary commercial transit. This episode has now been recorded in actuarial tables, underwriting models, and reinsurance treaty language. The Hormuz risk profile has been permanently repriced. Insurance markets do not return to pre-event pricing after a crisis of this magnitude without a sustained, multi-year period of incident-free operations under verifiable security guarantees. Neither condition currently exists. Iran has demonstrated the capability and willingness to convert Hormuz into a contested operating environment. That demonstrated capability is now a permanent actuarial input. Every voyage through the strait for the foreseeable future will be underwritten against a risk model that includes Iranian interdiction as a credible, precedented scenario. And premiums will reflect that assessment, regardless of the current diplomatic temperature. The downstream consequence is a permanent increase in the cost of energy transport from the Persian Gulf to every destination market, Europe, Asia, the United States, that will be absorbed somewhere in the supply chain. It will appear in refined product prices, in airline ticket costs, in the landed cost of petrochemical derivatives, and ultimately in the consumer price indices of every economy dependent on Gulf energy exports. The Ras Laffan industrial complex in Qatar, which accounts for approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas production, suffered infrastructure damage sufficient to reduce export capacity by 17%. Rystad Energy's preliminary estimate of total regional energy infrastructure reconstruction costs exceeds $25 billion. That capital expenditure, when it occurs, will be financed and amortized into the cost structure of Gulf energy production for a decade. The macroeconomic transmission. The macroeconomic transmission of a sustained Hormuz disruption operates through three simultaneous channels: direct energy price inflation, supply chain cost escalation, and sovereign fiscal stress in energy importing economies. The direct energy price channel is the most visible. With Gulf crude exports reduced by more than 10 million barrels per day for approximately 1 month, the global spare capacity buffer, the roughly 3 to 4 million barrels per day of excess production capacity that OPEC maintains as a price stabilization mechanism, was effectively consumed and exceeded by the supply deficit. There is no volume of additional production from U.S. shale, Canadian oil sands, or Norwegian North Sea assets that can replace 10 million barrels per day of Gulf output on a timeline measured in weeks. The supply shock is, in the near term, inelastic. The supply chain escalation channel is less visible but equally consequential. Petrochemicals, plastics, synthetic fertilizers, pharmaceutical precursors, and aviation fuel are all derived from Gulf crude and gas feedstocks. Disruptions to their supply propagate through manufacturing cost structures globally, appearing in product prices across sectors with no obvious connection to oil markets. Food production costs escalate as fertilizer prices rise. Agricultural commodity prices follow. The inflationary impulse from a Hormuz closure is not confined to energy. It is a broad-spectrum cost shock that embeds itself across the entire goods-producing economy. The geopolitical order realignment. The fourth and most consequential domain is the one least amenable to quantification, the structural damage to the post-1980 Gulf Security Order that the Hormuz crisis has now made undeniable. The Carter Doctrine established that the United States would treat any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf as an assault on vital American interests, to be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. For 46 years, that doctrine has been the load-bearing assumption of Gulf Arab security calculations. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain have hosted U.S. military infrastructure, accepted American strategic primacy, and calibrated their defense and foreign policies around the credibility of that guarantee. The ceasefire of April 7th has introduced a systemic credibility deficit into that guarantee that no subsequent diplomatic statement can fully repair. Iran did not merely threaten Hormuz, it closed it, held it closed for approximately 1 month, extracted a de facto acknowledgement of its transit authority from the United States as a condition of the ceasefire, and emerged from the engagement with its Hormuz veto power formally intact and internationally acknowledged. The Iranian tolling fee proposal, an unofficial range of $1 to $2 per barrel applied to Gulf Arab crude transiting the strait, is not an economic instrument. It is a sovereignty instrument. It is Tehran demonstrating to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait City that their energy exports now transit Iranian-administered waters, and that the United States either could not or would not prevent that outcome. The Gulf Arab states are now conducting foreign and security policy in a strategic environment in which their primary security guarantor has visibly accepted Iranian administrative authority over their export lifeline. That calculation will drive defense procurement decisions, sovereign wealth fund allocation strategies, diplomatic realignments, and ultimately the long-term trajectory of petrodollar recycling flows and dollar-denominated energy pricing, the foundational architecture of American financial hegemony in the post-Bretton Woods era. 16 million barrels a day will flow again, but they will never flow the same way again. I have walked you through the geography, the hardware, the engagement sequencing, and the macroeconomic transmission. Now I want to tell you where I actually stand, because this is the part that keeps me at the map table at 0200. Washington is currently facing a strategic dilemma with no clean exit vector, and I want to frame it with the precision it deserves. Path 1. The United States reasserts freedom of navigation doctrine through demonstrated kinetic enforcement. It deploys additional carrier strike group assets into the Gulf operating area, formally rejects Iranian transit authority over the strait, and escorts commercial tankers through Hormuz under naval protection, daring Tehran to test the deterrent. The upside is credibility restoration with Gulf Arab partners and a temporary suppression of Iranian toll collection ambitions. The downside is an operating environment in which U.S. naval assets are continuously exposed to the exact layered A280 architecture I have just briefed you on. Magazine exhaustion tactics, ballistic anti-ship missile saturation, fast attack swarm operations, and mining threats in shallow, confined waters specifically engineered to neutralize carrier strike group standoff advantages. Every day those assets operate inside the Hormuz envelope, they are consuming deterrent credibility faster than they are generating it, because Iran only needs one catastrophic engagement to collapse the entire strategic construct. One Burke-class destroyer mission, killed by a Khalij Fars ballistic anti-ship missile on live satellite imagery, changes the conversation permanently. Path 2. Washington accepts the new operational reality, negotiates the parameters of Iranian transit authority, pressures Gulf Arab producers to absorb the tolling fee, and redirects strategic focus toward accelerating alternative export infrastructure, additional Red Sea pipeline capacity, expanded Fujairah terminal throughput, long-term Omani transit agreements. The upside is avoiding a kinetic exchange in an environment that geometrically favors the defender. The downside is the explicit abandonment of the Carter Doctrine, 46 years of American strategic commitment to Gulf security, and the downstream unraveling of the petrodollar architecture, Gulf Arab alignment, and the broader credibility of U.S. security guarantees from Taipei to Tallinn. There is no path 3. There is no option that restores the pre-war baseline without cost. That is the dilemma I am sitting with tonight, and I want to know where you sit on it. Drop your tactical assessment in the comments below. Are you in the enforcement camp or the accommodation camp? And what is your read on the timeline before this ceasefire collapses entirely? I read every comment personally, and the most incisive assessments will be featured in tomorrow's briefing. If this analysis reached you at a level that the mainstream coverage has not, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's briefing covers the internal fracture lines inside OPEC that the Hormuz crisis has now made structurally irreparable, and why the next move may not come from Tehran or Washington, but from Riyadh. This is not over. It has barely begun.